kick it off with the staff presentation.
Yeah, good evening. Tonight it's our pleasure to present the draft 2018-2023 Capital Improvement Program, or commonly referred to as CIP. While I have a moment, I would really like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the staff for the significant work and expertise in preparing this draft. The plan for this evening is to see a short video followed by a presentation and then an opportunity for council to provide feedback and ask any questions. So thank you. Jean?
Actually, we'll go right into the video. It provides a nice overview of, and a nicer way of presenting a lot of this information than we would.
The City of Boulder has an extensive inventory of assets and facilities, including highly used public spaces such as streets, libraries, recreation centers, pools, parks, and public areas like the Pearl Street Mall or our open space and mountain parks. Our essential assets include fire and police stations, water and stormwater systems, as well as those that most people don't see or use very frequently, such as city offices or maintenance buildings. Each year, the city revisits its Capital Improvement Program, or CIP, to plan for the city's future capital investments over the next 6 years. Guided by the community's sustainability framework, the CIP lays out a plan for maintaining, enhancing, and at times, expanding the city's capital infrastructure. The sustainability framework identifies 7 overarching themes, which are the basis for city plans, like the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan and Department Master Plans. The CIP is when a community vision becomes a reality. Boulder continues to be committed to the ongoing maintenance and repair of capital assets, recognizing the critical value of civic infrastructure to the economic, aesthetic, and functional viability of the city. In fact, over 3/4 of our CIP funding over the next year will be for maintenance and enhancements to existing assets. This approach of taking care of what we have saves the city money over time, as well as ensures the quality services the community expects. Community members will enjoy the benefits of a number of important projects that will be completed in 2017. These include the construction of significant improvements at Wonderland Creek, which will decrease risks to almost 600 homes, which are located in the 100-year floodplain. 3 new underpasses to provide safe passage for pedestrians and cyclists. The completion of the new Civic Area Park, which used voter-approved community culture and safety tax funding. The now completed Baseline Underpass, the city's 80th underpass, which is connecting a busy shopping center, nearby neighborhoods, and CU in a safe and easy connection, as well as the reconstruction of the Diagonal Highway, which replaced the existing roadway and constructed new medians, bicycle lanes, multi-use paths, sidewalks, and other amenities. The 2018 CIP, with proposed funding at just over $120 million, includes a range of capital investments, including facility enhancements throughout the city and maintenance and rehabilitation of existing infrastructure. Several high-priority safety, recreation, and mobility improvements include the Scott Carpenter Aquatics replacement and enhancement, which will replace and expand the aging pool and bathhouse to provide leisure amenities to serve all ages and abilities, as well as general park improvements. The 4-mile flood mitigation and multi-use underpass, which will provide flood mitigation in conjunction with multi-use path connections from 19th Street to Violet Crossing, providing safer access to Crestview Elementary School, recreational opportunities, and replacement of structurally deficient bridges. The Broadway reconstruction will provide reconstruction of Broadway from Violet Avenue to US 36 and will include bicycle and pedestrian and transit improvements. 2 new underpasses, 30th in Colorado, which will join the University of Colorado's main and east campuses with the neighborhoods in the area, providing a safe, new, grade-separated crossing and direct access to transit stops. And Foothills in Colorado, which will replace an existing bicycle pedestrian overpass bridge that is deteriorating and does not meet ADA design. Once completed, the new underpass will better connect East Boulder with CU and the parks, businesses, academic, and residential areas on either side of Foothill Parkway. And finally, the Carter Lake Pipeline, which will provide reliable and safe water from Carter Lake to the 63rd Street Treatment Facility. In 2014, voters supported a 0.3% sales tax for community culture and safety capital investment. Boulder will be able to fund essential safety projects and enhancements for recreation and mobility projects, commission new public arts, and also provide funding for several community-based nonprofits. This has been just a small sampling of the full list of capital investment planned in the city of Boulder. For that full list and description of the proposed capital projects over the next 6 years, please see the 2018 to 2023 Draft Capital Improvements Program. As always, Boulder will continue to invest in our capital infrastructure in order to ensure our community is a sustainable and resilient city.
Well, thank you. Some of the numbers will change in the video, and we can adjust those, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's a nice thing to have on our website for our community members to know where their capital dollars are going and to be able to have it as a place that tells that story. So, again, good evening. Katie and I are here to just briefly provide an overview about the capital improvement program and highlight some of these key areas in the capital budget for this year. And I'd like to echo Mary Ann's comments about thanking all of staff and the tremendous effort that goes into all of the information that comes together and all of the dedication of the staff members that put into getting this through our advisory boards and our staff review and our executive review, and to all of the fine details of putting it together into the document. So it's a fine collaborative effort between planning and finance, and then all the rest of the departments that have capital projects too. So with that, the 6-year CIP is both a planning and a financial guide to our city's capital assets. The departments work together to determine the right coordination of projects that maximize leveraged funding, find cost savings, and also reduce the impact to the community during the time that the work is being done. So as was shown in the video, we relate our capital improvement program back to our sustainability framework. By the city charter, the planning department helps coordinate the CIP, and the reason for that is that the CIP really serves as that tool that implements our Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. Where we invest in our capital projects and our capital improvements determines how we impact service delivery and the livability in the community. The budget's really a reflection of our community values, and the capital budget is a key way that we implement the policies and the values of our comprehensive plan. We use a set of guiding principles to guide the citywide development of the capital budget. These were in your memo and are in the document. They build on the community and organizational values around budgeting and land use, including, as we said, considering how the capital improvement program achieves our community sustainability goals, consistency with implementing the comprehensive plan, master plans, and our area plans, sustaining and improving existing assets before investing in new assets and new facilities, and maximizing efficiency of investments through the coordination of the projects, both across departments and within departments and funds. So this process slide just shows the annual schedule for the CIP review, but I mean, as most of you know, the CIP really gets developed far to the left over years and years as the projects move forward in the 6-year plan, but really being identified in our master planning processes, our area planning processes, and our service delivery and service programs, the departments. There are a number of opportunities for public input, both in the processes that lead up to the CIP, the advisory boards as they review each CIP, and in the planning and design for individual projects. I also like to highlight on this slide, we have a number of departmental master plans that have started or will be underway in the next couple of years. So all of these will be feeding into the CIP planning over the next few years. This work will evaluate service delivery, systems needs, community expectations, and prioritize a lot of these capital needs as we move forward. Then I'm going to turn it over to Katie for a couple of slides.
Good evening. Before I went into the 2018 to 2023 financial picture, I wanted to update council and touch upon what's changed since what you've seen in the budget book due to revised revenue pictures. As you've been hearing for over a year now, when the caution flags were flying last May, the city's been closely monitoring trends in sales and use tax. And what we've noticed based upon analysis is that sales and use tax forecasts have revised down for 2017 and 2018. This is specifically in the most volatile sources like construction use tax and business use tax. It's important to know that the data is a month lagging, so we're still monitoring what June and half the year is brought in, and we'll be revising our projections as needed and bring forward during the operating budget discussion. There's three major funds that are affected with this change that are sales tax based. Transportation Fund, Open Space and Mountain Parks, and the Parks and Recreation Fund. Each have taken different strategies to adjust their projects in the coming year and the out years. With transportation, their strategy will be to shift the timing of certain projects. It's also important to note that the shifts are made in accordance with the priorities of the Transportation Master Plan, and they focus on slowing enhancements to the system while prioritizing maintenance. The Open Space and Mountain Parks won't have any changes for the 2018 budget, but they may need to utilize reserves in future years if revenue projections don't look any better. They have a pretty high reserve at 20% currently. Parks and Recreation has various funds that fund the department, and so one is based upon sales and use tax and the other is based upon property tax. So their strategy will be to shift funding sources of select projects to help offset the changes in sales and use tax. So I wanted to first refer back to the 2017 to 2022, it isn't a mistake up there, and highlight how in 2018 and what we've seen, and to Jean's point over the annual CIP process, we've known that 2018 is going to be a rather large year. And so you'll see this coming into 2018 to the 2023 CIP allocations, that 2018 is in fact a fairly large year due to several large projects that I'll highlight. One's including the Carter Lake Pipeline. It's almost $32 million, and so that's a drastic change. The Sewer Interceptor, Scott Carpenter Park, and some various transportation projects are also leading to the increase for 2018. The majority of funding continues to be in the Utilities Division. It's used to maintain significant infrastructure needed to provide safe water and resources to Boulder. You'll also notice in this chart that the funding ebbs and flows based upon cyclical facility maintenance and upgrades needs, as well as timing of new projects. One thing that you'll be hearing more about during the operating discussion is the notion to develop a capital program for the general fund departments, which you don't see up here. These are all dedicated funding sources. But as we know, and as we've seen in the capital tax renewal discussions, there's critical infrastructure in general fund departments like police, fire, and IT that require an investment from the city. And we're planning to propose some sort of phase one of this capital idea and building upon it in the next year. As you saw in the video, 86% of our funding is related to capital maintenance and enhancements. The other categories include new capital projects, which could be for construction for additional square footage. Capital enhancements and maintenance refer to repair replacements of existing assets. And then land and asset acquisition is acquisition of real property. Capital planning studies continues to be our smallest, but a very crucial part in the capital planning process. Jean's going to walk through some of the projects that fall into the category of capital maintenance and enhancements to show what those really mean to the city.
So as I mentioned, one of the key guiding principles is really about taking care of what we have and focusing our capital investments on maintenance and enhancements. So the majority of the CIP is in system and project maintenance and enhancements. We're a mature community, we're not expanding outwards, but we're paying attention to our systems and our facilities and our levels of service. Many of the projects are repair, replacement, and renovations to existing assets. Others are enhancements to existing assets and systems. For example, some of the improvements that we saw in the CIP tour up at Patasso were maintenance and repair, but they were also enhancements to the system. Because whenever we endeavor, I mean, our community has high expectations. Whenever we endeavor to do maintenance and repair, we're looking for enhancements and system upgrades that make sense. Some of the other projects that we categorize under system enhancements, some of the new underpasses or new multi-use paths, the pool enhancements, some of the recreation center types of things, we still categorize those as existing facilities or existing system enhancements. So there's a lot in there, but a lot of really great projects. So the CIP shows highlights of our completed and nearly completed projects, as well as upcoming projects. And this year we did a little different graphic representation to show within the context of the sustainability framework. Lots of these projects, as we mentioned, have been programmed over the 6 years, and they're in key areas around that sustainability framework, transportation and mobility, also in the utilities for safety, big projects, as Katie mentioned, Carter Lake Pipeline, and some of the flood improvements to address health and safety, and then also health and recreation with a lot of our improvements to recreation facilities. The highlights touch on the bigger, higher profile projects, but as you can see with the very thick CIP, we've got a lot of the smaller projects that impact folks on a day-to-day basis, the sidewalk improvements or the neighborhood park improvements or the parking structure upgrades. So the full CIP provides that full picture of both the big high-profile projects that we plan for a long time and the smaller ones that impact people on a daily basis. We also highlighted Central Boulder long-term planning in the CIP. We need to make sure that we represent to the community that these big planning processes that are going on in these key areas of the downtown and the core area of the city are done they're separate projects, but we're doing them in a coordinated and aligned way to make sure that we're meeting goals for the area all the way across those planning processes and thinking about the capital projects as they're moving forward in a coordinated way. And one other highlight section within the CIP this year is on public art. Over time, we've had public art projects that are part of our capital projects, but what we're moving toward is a policy and a sustainable funding source to show that in a more coordinated and aligned way. Looking toward a policy that's a percent for art and maintenance of that art, and to be able to highlight each year where we're expecting public art to be aligned with the capital projects that are happening where they're public spaces. So for this upcoming year, we've got a civic area public art project, 13th and Arapahoe underpass, the North Broadway reconstruction, and the new underpasses at Colorado at 30th and Foothills too. So we'll be anticipating public art projects as a component of that. And as the CIP, each year we'd be highlighting where we have public art within the CIP. So as I mentioned, all of our advisory boards provide input into that department's CIP, and those motions are included in your memo. In late July, the planning board reviewed the capital improvements program and the list of projects that undergo a community and environmental assessment process. They unanimously recommended adoption of the draft CIP. The board also passed a motion emphasizing the new comprehensive plan policies around supporting local businesses and asked about exploring ways that we might amend or change or implement our procurement policy around trying to support local businesses. The board also passed a motion in support of the funding and the continued funding and increased funding for public art, and of which we have a plan moving forward to be funding that in a long-term way and also more consistently.
Sure. So the next steps, on September 12th, you'll hear a study session around the operating budget specifically. In October, we're going to be having budget public hearings. This is the opportunity for the public to provide input on our proposal, both for the operating budget and the CIP. And after those hearings, the council will adopt the 2018 budget. By charter, it needs to be adopted by December 1st, which will also include the CIP budget. So we have two questions that were outlined in the memo for you tonight. One is the 2018 to 2023 CIP consistent with the goals and policies of the city, including the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan and Sustainability Framework? And the second is, does council have any feedback or questions regarding the CIP? So we'll open it up to you now.
Great, thank you very much. Maybe we'll start with questions. Looks like Bob's got his hand up and go from there.
Great, that was real helpful. Could you explain to us how, I think you started to talk a little bit about it, but maybe go a little deeper in how the CIP was in front of us dovetails with the proposed capital tax, the 0.3% capital tax. I noticed that there's at least 3 projects that I think are in both buckets, the public art, the res, and Scott Carpenter. And I know you're not double counting here. I know that there's bits and pieces here, but can you tell us how that kind of interacts? And 4 Mile, that's right. Thank you. So there's 4 of them at least, yeah.
So there, and we have staff here that can probably dig a little deeper than I can, but I'll do the overview of, there are components of the projects, the maintenance parts of them. So for example, for Scott Carpenter, the replacement of the pool, that's in our current CIP. Some of the enhancements are part of the funding that would be anticipated with the renewed community culture and safety. Similar to with 4 Mile, 4 Mile has the flood improvements, that's part of the flood enterprise funding, and then some greenways funding for some of the path improvements and the work that's in conjunction with that. But the bridge replacement and some of the other path replacements would be part of the capital tax. So effectively, if the tax passes, those will be wrapped into the CIP, and those projects will be able to move ahead with those enhancements quicker. If the tax does not pass, those projects the scope will be adjusted, or the timing will be adjusted for the needs of those.
And with respect to the art, is it just kind of like some art and more art?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Can I ask an associated question?
Go ahead if it's right on the issue.
You mind, Matt? Okay, my question is just, it seems like some of the projects that are in the community and culture tax, like the police communications infrastructure, such a basic for health and safety. Why wouldn't that go in as a high priority in the SIP rather than putting that in the community and culture tax?
So that's one of our key unfunded needs that has been moving along in the process. We completed the study for the radio infrastructure last year and have a really good sense of what that funding is now. So that being a very important health and safety project, as you say, if the tax doesn't pass, we'll be adjusting the budgets and the CIP to make sure that we can.
So you're saying if it didn't pass, we would replace it and put it in the CIP?
We would find general fund dollars to work that in.
Interesting.
Yeah, it goes to the comment around how we want to develop a general fund capital program that can anticipate and plan for critical infrastructure around these general fund departments like police and fire and IT. And we always want to create a conservative budget where we don't anticipate that taxes will pass. And so we've folded it into the operating discussion because it wasn't quite ready to be presented as part of the capital improvement program, but falls a little bit more in line with operating dollars right now.
Mm-hmm. So the movement of the fire station would be in that category too?
Likely not due to revenue projections, but it's a discussion that we'll need to have on September 12th around priorities.
Okay, thanks.
Ed, Mary, and then Matt.
Thanks, Jean. Thanks, Jean, for the presentation. I have several questions. This one is transportation, and please excuse me if you answered some of this deeper in the material was presented in different places in different formats, so I may not have caught the answers. In any case, my first question is has to do with the missing links and crossings, so it's a transportation question.
For specific projects, I'm going to ask Garrett to come up and
Okay.
help answer.
I was more interested in finding out what the process is for determining which missing links will get funded.
So we have every year we have a prioritization effort where we identify, Garrett Slater with transportation. So every year we prioritize locations where we have missing sidewalk links within the pedestrian system, and that can include both the along as well as the across for the facilities. So there's a prioritization for places where we might want to implement crossing treatments as well as missing links for the sidewalk. So we call that our PED treatment budget.
And does the process include usage? Like, does a link that has more pedestrian use have higher priority over one that doesn't?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And I have more transportation questions, I believe. No, maybe not. Sorry.
All right.
Thank you. On the OSMP campus relocation, there's a budget of $7 million, and I was curious to understand how that number was arrived at, since there's not a known location, and it's sort of, from what I understand, still kind of being determined.
Hi there, Lauren Kilcoyne, OSMP. Most of what you see in the CIP for the campus relocation addresses our interim space. So through our multi-phased campus assessment, we realized that unfortunately we will likely have to move twice. So we'll be moving into an interim space while we develop further that longer term vision. So you're right, that $7 million would essentially cover the lease on our interim space and some additional planning efforts for the long-term vision.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, you said include lease payments? Why would that be in the capital budget?
It's been part of a multi-year capital project to develop our options around our future space. And that was in working with partners in finance and in the department and our consultants. That was the recommendation, that we have that flexibility depending on the timing of when the future space comes up, that we would have capital funding available to handle the interim and the long-term need.
Thanks. I guess I'll turn to finance, because I don't have a problem with it. I'm just curious, because I would expect lease payments to not be included in a capital budget. So maybe you can just explain how that works.
Yeah, I think it's exactly what Lauren said, is that it provides flexibility, given that we're not quite sure the length of time, that it could reallocate some of those dollars to finding the land if the lease term ends up being shorter.
I guess it still doesn't quite get to the fundamental of how lease payments become part of a capital budget.
How about I follow up on that
Okay.
and get a little bit more detail?
That's fine. Thank you.
I have another open space question. During the presentation, you mentioned that the open space fund may have to dip into reserves. And 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we switched the part of the open space tax to transportation. So I'm wondering, in that analysis, did something change that now we're thinking we may need to dip into reserves?
Yeah, thanks for the question. We have been working for the last several years on what the right reserve amount is for such a sales tax dependent department. And a couple years ago, we increased from 10% up to 20% in contingency reserves. We've also been maintaining a very strong fund balance. We knew that 2 increments of our sales tax would be expiring, one in 2019 and the other in 2020, and just knew we wanted to prepare years in advance and start reserving funds and keeping that fund balance available for when that day came. And with the revised revenue projections over the last month, we don't anticipate any changes needed for the current year or for next year, but we're looking at maybe a year earlier than anticipated between revenues and the expiration of sales tax, making some adjustments there.
So your anticipation of dipping into the reserve funds is purely revenue projections?
It is, yeah, and of course, things continue to shift, and we're trying to be as conservative as possible right now. We'll make every effort, of course, to spend as close to within annual revenues as we can, but we have known for a number of years that 2019 and 2020 will be a shift for the department with the expiration of sales tax. So we're just trying to be really proactive and conservative and have those dollars set aside.
Thank you. I think that's all the open space questions. So the next one, again, is transportation, has to do with the railroad quiet zones. So as I recall, the memo or somewhere I saw that the total cost for the railroad quiet zones was $3 million. And I recall prior to this hearing $5 million. So something changed, and so I wanted to understand that.
So part of that reduction in the overall costs was when we were first looking at the implementation measures, we were assuming worst-case scenario at each of the crossings. But after conducting a site investigation with representatives from BNSF, from the federal, from Burlington Northern, from the Federal Railroad Administration, the county, and as well the Public Utilities Commission, we were able to identify that in a number of locations there are already a number of existing features that limit the amount of enhancements that are needed at the crossing locations to bring them into quiet zone compliance. And so that is what allowed what followed then was a reduction in the overall cost to implement the improvements at each of those crossings.
Okay.
For example, at Pearl, it was assumed that there was going to need to be full-scale reconstruction when, of course, we'd already gone through and taken care of Pearl. And our consultant had just assumed worst-case scenario throughout the system.
Thank you. And so is there a certain amount of momentum that you're gaining here on this project that would be advantageous to just go ahead and fund the other $1.5 million somehow?
With respect to the momentum, I'm not sure how to respond to that, but I would say that there would be an opportunity to take advantage of the construction cost dollars that we have in place now as opposed to later. So that would be an advantage to implementing all the crossings sooner than later.
Okay. Thanks, Garrett.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
Do you want to go first? So do you know, we had an item in the capital tax improvement for railroad quiet zones. Do you know if the dollar amount of that reflected those lower budget amounts?
Yes, it does.
Great, so it's just $1.5 million then, not?
Right, so we currently have funded 1.3 million, and the capital sales tax extension is proposing 1.5 for a total of 2.8.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks for that question, Mary.
I have a question about maintenance at railroad areas. There's been a citizen talking to me about some of the recent derailment and some of the dangers that occur from type of action on tracks called mud and pumping. And so if you have pooled water nearby where the railroad embankments are, you can get this degradation of track and tie quality. So I'm curious, where does the maintenance lines get drawn? So for instance, there's a pool of standing water over near the Pearl Crossing, which is one that is of concern because of the high population there. And so how do we divide up what the city does as far as, say, drainage goes versus what BNSF does for drainage?
So In terms of maintenance responsibilities, it's largely assessed by who was there first and as well the right-of-way that's in place. So, and the BNSF right-of-way was there long before city street rights-of-way were present. So if there are maintenance issues such as track maintenance or drainage issues that are occurring within their right-of-way, we as a city don't actually have any purview to be able to go in and tell them what to do inside their right-of-way. We actually have to formally request permission to enter their right-of-way, or we actually, when we go out and meet with them, we have to wait until they arrive on site in order to actually be able to enter their right-of-way. So what we've learned is that what we have the opportunity to do is to notify them of our concerns, and they'll note them and prioritize them as they see fit.
Okay, and is there an employee of the city for whom that's a responsibility to, note issues at tracks or road crossings of tracks and report it to BNSF?
Over the years, there have been a couple of city staff that have primarily been responsible for interactions with the railroad, and I'd say it seems in my tenure here, that's been a responsibility that's largely fallen to me. So I think I'm the guy.
Okay, well, I'll be writing you an email later.
I have a follow-up question on my own question. I just wanted clarification on the numbers that you just responded to Aaron's question with, because now I'm confused about how much gap we have in totally funding the quiet zones.
So we have funding in place now in the CIP, largely due to having received a federal grant for a total project of $1.3 million. And with the sales tax extension, we're requesting an additional 1.5 for a total of $2.8 million to be able to address the improvements at all 9 crossings.
And the federal grant you're referring to is the Dr. Cog money?
Correct.
Okay, that's where the piece I was missing. Okay, thank you.
I'm going to follow up on that real quick. The 1.3, is that something that has to be spread out across all, or, for example, if that's what we were stuck with, could we apply that to a few locations, or does that have to be, to get the grant, did we have to improve every site?
So the terms and conditions of the grant did not stipulate where we needed to implement those, but through a public engagement process and through a prioritization effort that was fairly robust in its length and magnitude, we determined that Pearl, Valmont, and 47th should be the recipients of the initial funds of that grant.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
Okay. My next question is, guess what? Transportation. This is with respect to the rehab runway and eastern taxiway at the airport. And the question has to do with the airport fund. I was curious to know what revenues make up the airport fund.
Good evening. So
Just state your name.
Oh, sorry, Mike Sweeney, Director of Public Works for Transportation. The airport fund is a combination of lease revenues for ground leases for facilities that are on the airport property, and then the runway facilities are primarily funded through the FAA. So if you divide it, and the terminology is the air side and the land side. So the facilities and the maintenance of the hangars and those types of things is primarily funded through lease revenues, and then the runway, taxiway, apron areas are primarily funded through the FAA. And our FAA money is through an allocation system that we share with other municipal airports up and down the Front Range. And generally, the funding for the runway facilities is a 98% federal, 2% local, of which CDOT at one time was providing 1% of that, was providing half of that local match. But they are no longer doing that. So, for instance, on the project that's listed in the CIP, which is the overlay of the runway facility, that's 98% FAA, 2% city.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
You bet.
And almost done here. And this is a utility question. I have to read it sideways because if I turn it around, the iPad flips it. So this question is about the automated meter reading, and the allocated amount there is $740,000. And for automated reading, as I recall, years ago when that happened, it was like a long process, and there were hardware was put in and stuff. And so I'm surprised to see that number actually seems low to me. So I was curious to know what that automated reading is actually.
Yeah, so it's significantly more. Our estimation at this point is that we probably have 5-6 years before we need to start replacing our existing fleet of meters. So the idea would be to start accruing funds to be able to do that in the future. Ideally, we would phase it over multiple years. The meters we have now were put in, I think, over a 5 or 6 year period, so they won't all hit the end of their useful life at once. So at this point, we're really starting to explore what the technology will likely be at that point, because what we have now is rather simplistic. It's drive-by, once-a-month reads, and modern technology would allow us to do some real-time things and some enhancements that would likely be of benefit.
Jeff, for the members of the public, could you just ID yourself for the...
I'm sorry, Jeff Arthur, Director of Public Works for Utilities.
Thanks, Jeff. I have another utilities question. I think that's my final question. And this has to do with the Goose Creek repair between 19th and Folsom. And that part of Goose Creek is concrete banks. And I was curious if this upgrades to Goose Creek will include removing the concrete.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to Annie Noble, who's our flood and greenways coordinator, and probably answer it more quickly than I can.
Okay, so the section of Goose Creek between 19th and Folsom it barely has like a 2-year capacity, so we're currently looking at evaluating different options to increase the capacity, and also we're working in conjunction with the storm sewer system to look at different sizing of that, so 5-10 year increase, and so if we were to do improvements to the channel, we would take out the concrete, make it a little deeper and increase the capacity. It'll probably take some of the people out of the 100-year floodplain, but not all of them. So it's a combination of a storm sewer project and a flood mitigation project. And we're in the middle of a flood mitigation plan for Upper Goose Creek and looking at options.
Okay. Thank you, Annie. That's all I have.
Okay, Matt?
Yeah, I want to go back to some of the questions that Bob and Jan were asking. They're kind of general, but I'll try to make them project related. So the question about the money for the upgrade for the radio infrastructure, and this is kind of a general question I have, is so if this tax doesn't pass, are we going to go ahead and do some of these things anyway because they're really high priority, or are they not? And you said, well, for the radio infrastructure, we would go ahead and do it. So it would be really nice to know, honestly, and this isn't tonight, I suppose, what we wouldn't do. Because in effect, it seems to me, and maybe this is more of a comment than a question, but I'll just go ahead with it, that really, if this is on the ballot, we're not really funding this. This is going to get funded anyway. What we're funding is the stuff that would get knocked off if we had to fund this. It just seems like we're going about this backwards. In other words, if this is really the community's top priority, it should be in the CIP, not in some potential ballot issue that might or might not pass. And it's the stuff that could come off that isn't absolutely dire essential that should really be in the ballot issue. So I don't expect you to answer that, but what I would like to know is a better sense of, so what would come off? What gets bumped, essentially, if this has to be funded in the next 3 years or so? because it is so critical, and I'm assuming it's critical. You said that you thought we would fund it, and I don't doubt that. I would certainly fund it. It makes sense. So that's a question, but not obviously to be answered right at this minute.
If I could just add to that too, I mean, just to be clear as well, especially if you're going to answer this in writing, would be not just both what would still be done and then what would be bumped off so that I mean, to Matt's point, I had the same kind of question in mind. It's almost like we put the sexy projects on the ballot
It's not almost like.
But it, so
It is.
Anyway, yeah, all right.
So, and maybe one of the other.
No, it doesn't actually.
The other question, though, that might impact this would be about timing, because it might take longer to get these done if we don't have this. So there would be another piece to learn about.
So kind of similar questions on some of the other items, kind of taking them one at a time. I mean, I understand the answer, I guess, to the fire station, which I'm assuming all of us here think is critical, is that's so expensive that it'd be hard, you have to bump everything else off essentially to fund it, although it's also so critical, maybe we would do that if we had to, but that's a really big ticket item, so maybe it's in its own category. But let me ask about some of the other ones. So Scott Carpenter, the pool, and I think this was explained to us by Yvette last time, but I may have missed something, so my fault. But it sounds like what's in the CIP, that's in the draft CIP that's in front of us, is kind of the basic rebuilding of the pool. So that happens anyway. And what's on the potential ballot is kind of some additional upgrades. And I guess my question is, since somebody's here, conveniently, kind of the same thing. I mean, if it weren't on the ballot or if the ballot didn't pass, would Parks find that money? Is that the next highest priority? Is it okay if it waited for a while? Should it just be in the CIP? That's what I'm trying to understand, how some things are in one bucket and some things are in another, and it's a little unclear to me, frankly.
Well, just Jeff Haley, Planning Manager with Parks and Rec. Garrett kind of touched on it earlier in terms of the construction, the capacity we have today in today's construction dollars to do improvements all at once. And so with regard to Scott Carpenter, what's definitely in the RCIP, which is in front of you this evening, is to replace the pool. That's really the basic need that needs to be maintained and renovated through this project. In fact, that was the overwhelming desire from the community, as well as our study we did in 2015 through our aquatics feasibility study to replace that one-of-a-kind asset in the community. So that's the replacement and in fact, the expansion of the 50-meter pool is kind of the bread and butter of that project. What we're hoping to do with the capital tax renewal option is to go farther, to provide a range of family-friendly amenities, leisure pools, a splash pad, additional slides, instead of just renovating the bathhouse that exists today, actually expand it and provide community rooms and spaces. So it's basically, without going through all the details, it's taking a project that we're going to do, that we have to do, and allows us to go farther while we're in the ground, while we're doing construction. We would not be able to do that otherwise. Within our Parks and Rec capital budget, as Katie was mentioning, we have certain funds that provide a certain amount of money each year, but we're in that fiscally constrained model where we only have the funding we have. There's a chance where the community could come along and say, yeah, let's do more, if that helps.
Well, okay, but this is a 5-year CIP in front of us, and so what you're saying is, if you didn't get the funding from some new money that came along, that as nice as it is, these additional features to Scott Carpenter Pool are not a high enough priority, or they're not as high a priority as all the other stuff in the 5-year CIP, because otherwise presumably it would be in your 5-year CIP.
Correct. We go off the model of, as we mentioned earlier, the taking care of what we have. Our annual asset management program identifies a range of, in the millions of dollars of critical assets that need to be maintained or enhanced every year. To quickly answer the question, we may be able to come back in subsequent years and start doing some of those leisure amenities, but the capacity we have within our CIP, we typically renovate parks, replace playground equipment, replace pools, rehab rec centers. It's usually the maintenance and enhancement pieces as opposed to some of these other amenities.
So is the same general concept true? I wasn't going to ask this, but since you just raised something similar, out at the reservoir where what's in the CIP is a pretty major renovation of the reservoir, but it's not everything. There's still some additional things you'd like to do that clearly you didn't get into the 5-year CIP because you didn't have the fund. You didn't think you had the funding for it. So is it kind of the same concept there?
It is, correct. We look at it in terms of constructability, phasing. What can we do now? What do we have to do now? What are ways we could phase the project and do certain things later? So at the reservoir, for the most part, it's our visitor services center. So right now, that existing administration building with the restrooms and the little concession stand is in pretty bad shape from an asset management standpoint. It needs to be replaced, repaired, expanded. So that's the majority of what we're trying to accomplish with the CIP. Once again, we would like to do, and actually have designed a nice beach improvement. We would like to rebuild the lifeguard shack, which is the smaller building on site. So again, just a lot of amenities that they're not absolutely critical, but they definitely allow us to do more, to reach more of the community, to serve more of the community. And if we had those dollars now with this upcoming project next year, we could do that in current construction.
So just one more question, and I don't know if you could answer this or not, but for both of these projects, either of both of them, which may be in the bond issue, who knows what it's going to be, but is that because these really are the next top priorities in parks, or is it because we're doing construction anyway, and so it's kind of convenient to do the rest of it?
Excellent question. They are the top priorities. And so, in fact, we're providing some information to City Council as part of this next capital tax discussion. We went through a capital investment strategy. We worked very closely with our Parks and Rec Advisory Board, and we talked about all the needs from an asset management standpoint, neighborhood parks, rec centers, ball fields, pools, et cetera. We did a study session with them, and they actually got to vote and really discuss amongst themselves what are those priorities. So that capital investment strategy is specifically an outcome of our Parks and Rec Advisory Board. Concurrently with all these studies and engaging the community, we've asked the users as well, what are those most critical projects? And so they've, again, confirmed the pool, the reservoir, Valmont's in the list. And so those are the priorities. And we'll provide that information that goes into greater detail.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So you mentioned the reservoir. Mm-hmm. How does that rank in the ordering of those big projects that you just talked about?
It's probably number two. Not probably, it is number two. Mm-hmm. The pool, as you can read in our aquatics plan, is in very desperate shape in terms of needing replacement. So that's number one. And we prioritize these based on use. Some of the criteria you were mentioning earlier, how many people use it. Is there another one of its kind in the system? So the pool's number one simply because of its unique provision in the community. The reservoir is number two just because the age, the condition of that facility. We serve 300,000 visitors a year at the reservoir, a range of events, activities that need that facility. So.
Got it. And then as far as Valmont goes, I mean, one of the things that's hard to do is talk about numbers who attend something that isn't there. So what is the thinking on the timing for Valmont completion?
So Valmont, we are programming into the capital improvement program, the CIP, in 2020. But what that does, similar to the responses earlier, that basically allows us to go in and start doing some of the next phase of development. We recognize the community, it's important to take care of what we have and maintain and replace and repair, but we also want to always keep providing new amenities to keep with current trends and those sorts of things. So Valmont, it's kind of next on the priority just because it is a very critical park. We've seen increased growth in the east part of town near Valmont. There's a lot of neighborhoods in that area that don't have access to certain park amenities. So it allows us to start reaching into that area and serving those communities as well. But it's not as critical in terms of taking care of what we have, repair, replacement.
All right, thanks. I got some of the questions, but not on parks. Actually, the next one's on the 4 Mile Canyon Creek, and it's kind of the same question. I mean, these are all similar ideas. I'm just trying to get my head around this, which is, okay, if again the tax doesn't pass or something doesn't work out, are we going to go ahead and find the money, find a way to finish that portion of 4 Mile Canyon Creek from Broadway to 19th?
So we're currently doing a preliminary design for that section of 4 Mile, and our current estimate is $12.1 million for the whole project. And after we have completed the preliminary design, we'll have a better idea of what, a better estimate of the cost, and then we'll evaluate where we are with funding and where we are in, the flood fund and how much money we have and how we could either delay the project or how we could delay portions of the project.
Well, is it the flood fund or is it transportation? And we asked this whenever that was, we were talking about the ballot issue. The answer I thought I heard is, well, no, the funding for this portion of it would actually come from transportation.
Well, it's a little tricky because we're replacing two bridges that one is on Upland Avenue and one's on Violet Avenue. So theoretically, a bridge replacement can be entirely out of the transportation fund. They're structures that are in poor condition, but we're replacing them to be bigger so that they pass the 100-year flood. So that could be funded out of the flood fund. So we have done a cost estimate and we've divided up the costs as we see appropriately. I think the real cost that is purely transportation is the trail component, which is a very small portion of the total cost. So we've taken the portion that's the underpass under Upland and divided it 50-50 between transportation and flood, and the same on Violet. And theoretically, those proportions can change, but they serve both a flood and transportation benefit. So it's kind of hard to say.
It sounds like, unless these things have to be done together, and maybe they do, we could actually get the whole path done. It's just that we might not have the money to do the two bridges. Is that correct?
So the biggest portion of the project are going to be two underpasses, one at Upland Ave and one at Violet Ave. We could construct those. We could go back and look at what size we would need for a 100-year flood versus, what's the differential between a 100-year flood passing and a bike ped, sizing for a bike ped. And the incremental cost is probably minimal because you're, having to pay for pavement and mobilization and taking out the existing structure. So it's hard to apportion the costs exactly, but we could go in and build it, for a smaller size, but the incremental cost would be minimal to make it a bike ped underpass.
Okay, I just one other question on this one, and maybe this is a question for Mike, for transportation, which is, again, these are all pretty similar questions, which is, this finishing of this piece is not in the 5-year CIP for transportation. So the question is, how high a priority is it? And if the funding didn't appear from elsewhere, is it a high enough priority that you'd figure out a way to get it done in the 5 years by bumping something else, or maybe we'd find some outside funding or whatever it might be?
Yeah, so I think, with Greenways, it's really a unique opportunity where you're investing across a lot of different objectives, and you're trying to figure out how to create a priority which is across those different things. So from a transportation perspective, those linkages might not be all that high, but from a flood or riparian or habitat, those types of issues it may be. And so a lot of the time what we're trying to sort out is how do we meld those different priorities together and come up with a joint priority. And so I think we've been trying to sort that out as we get the various flood studies done and figure out, is there a way to combine the funding and fill some of the gaps if we have to fill those gaps?
So do these two bridges need to be replaced anyway, or are they basically being replaced because of flood issues? Or a little bit of both?
Yeah, the funny story is that they're actually made of wood, and one of them caught fire many years ago in the past, and so I think they're ready to be replaced, but Garrett has the details.
Right, so in 2015, we conducted an assessment and an inspection of all the minor structures within the city, which is around 250 total structures. And of those 250, the Violet and the Upland structures rated in the top 15 worst. So irrespective of the 4 Mile Canyon, we would need to go out and do some deck replacements on those bridges.
Okay, but still, they're not in your 5-year CIP, so they somehow didn't make it to the top of the heap.
Right. So this information came after a lot of the programming we have in place was sort of moving forward. But I would say that in the very near term, we would be identifying opportunities to take care of those needs since they're so pressing.
And we do have a programmatic line item in our budget that is for those.
Yeah, and that's what's hard to.
Right.
There's a lot of those kind of fairly big ticket line items. It makes perfectly good sense, honestly. But that was one of the questions as well. Could some of that go to this? And I understand why it's not totally allocated right this minute, because you have to kind of figure that out. You're not going to figure out for 5 years what you're going to do each and every year. That'd be kind of crazy. But it sounds like these are maybe big enough priorities that you would potentially get to them anyway.
I would agree, yes, I agree with that.
Right.
Okay, well, thanks.
We don't want any bridges catching fire, so.
Wow, that's kind of interesting.
Matt, to your earlier point.
Then a flood would put it out, right?
The committee asked, and we had provided information on the projects that were proposed for the community culture safety tax renewal about what would happen if it doesn't get passed and some of the prioritization of these. So we can make sure that we can point you to that information and include some of that in the next memo for discussion.
That would be good. I mean, the other one that's in that list is the library in North Boulder. I don't really have any questions about it other than it's kind of in that same category of, well, would you do it anyway in the 5-year period? Because it's not in the 5-year CIP.
And I think that's, I mean, back to the radio infrastructure and the fire station. So many of the parks and transportation and other projects have the dedicated funds that are moving, that fund their CIP. So there's anticipated funding. And as Katie mentioned, as we work toward creating a more general fund CIP allocated amount, we'll be able to plan forward a lot of these essential needs and essential replacements that will show up in a more 6-year plan.
Yeah, no, I get that. The general fund's the difficult one, and it always has been, because if you do CIP from the general fund, well, you're not going to put money into some operating. It's all one big budget. And I think that is something we need to talk about during the budget, but in the meantime, this is in front of us. So only one other question I have really, which is, and again, you can come back, and I always find the most interesting part of these memos, frankly, is the unfunded needs, which is kind of at the end. And it's a really big list, and some of those are really gigantic numbers. And I understand many of them aren't quite ready yet, although some of them would be within a 5-year period, presumably. And it would be nice to get at least some sense of how we think we might deal with some of the really big numbers. And I'll just toss out, one idea. For the hospital site, it's true the city might do some public-private partnership. There might be a whole variety of ways you could fund that, where you wouldn't have to go and actually raise taxes in some way, or in a sense compete. But for many of the other ones, like the other fire stations and a whole bunch of other big ticket items here, I think you just have to find a way to fund them. There isn't very obvious how else you would do it. So it would be, for me, it would be just really helpful to get a sense of, in the next 5 to 8 years, how many of those things we think, so it's nice to have a big list of unfunded needs, but I mean, how many of them do we really think are going to hit in the next 5, 6, 7 years? And how are we going to deal with them? We're just going to have to go back to the voters and ask for more money? Or what is it that we're going to do exactly? Because, I mean, it's hundreds of millions of dollars of projects, and it sure seemed to me like many of them are going to have to be dealt with. I mean, we are going to do something with the hospital site. We are going to do something, I hope, with some of the other fire stations and so on and so on. So that's kind of another general question that if you could, and we got time before we get back to this, you know, budget days, but give us a little bit of insight into that, because those are frankly, the scarier numbers.
Yeah, I mean, they're a wide variety of different needs of a wide, much different magnitudes. Clearly, you're going to have to be a combination of a lot of different things. Some are critical infrastructure, and some are more of the area planning, new types of things, and other types of things. So we're going to be needing to think through a lot of different solutions to those.
And one other thing, and it might be in the memo or in the draft CIP, and I may have missed it, but do we have a list of which of these projects in the 5-year CIP are being funded either entirely or mostly by the general fund as opposed to the dedicated funds? Because that would also be helpful in terms of, I mean, I looked for that, I didn't see it, but it very well may be there. Because that may be very helpful in this kind of thinking about, well, you got to do the radio infrastructure anyway, no matter what. What else is in there that's being funded by the general fund? Because the things being funded by dedicated funds, well, they're not competing in that sense. You're not going to get your radio infrastructure money from them. It has to be from general fund projects. So it'd be really nice to see that list sorted by who's paying for it.
So that unfunded needs.
No, this is the stuff in the CIP.
The things in the CIP, I mean, I think only the sort of general fund would be some of the FAM things that are facilities.
Yeah, it may not be very many.
Yeah.
But it'd be nice to see. I mean, I've always gotten the sense I'll say this, you can tell me if I'm wrong, we don't actually use a whole lot of general fund money for capital projects, with the exception of once in a while, something for fire or police or whatever, or the library, actually, because their money almost entirely comes from the general fund. Well, it'd still be nice to see that broken out by the fund. Thanks very much.
Jan, next.
Thanks for all your work on this. I'd like to jump on a little bit to what Matt was just discussing. I'm going to make a statement first, and then I'm going to get to questions, I promise. This is very difficult to get your hands around, and the way it is presented. And, I mean, most of it is sideways as you're trying to read it. And we are the budget watchdogs for this city, so we should understand this and be able to really vet one opportunity versus another, and I think that's what Matt was getting to. I would love to see this sorted in a different way, and I mean, you guys tried to, you divided it up in categories, but it's hard for us to know what is kind of run rate and what is critical versus what is not. And so some way of designating what is run rate, particularly with health and safety kinds of activities and utilities, and that really just has to be done. And then the things where we as an organization need to help make decisions, if that could be pulled out, and then sorted top to bottom, so that we can make the puts and takes. I mean, our boards and commissions aren't going to do that because they're looking at one little piece of that. So I'm not surprised that they were all unanimous, but we have to make the tough decisions. So presenting that information in a way that would be easier for us would be extremely helpful, because this is almost impossible, I would say. And I don't know if there's a way you could do that, even just an Excel spreadsheet with pivot tables, so that you could sort in different ways. So I do have some specific questions, and unfortunately, they're not organized very well by by department, but I'm going to start with IT. It was difficult for me to tell from all the requests. There was a big number in there, $4.5 million for end-user devices, and I was wondering, are we covering everything? There were some big needs in the audit that came out that we need to fix. So to me, the higher priority would be to fix the things that came out in our audit versus the end-user devices, which in many cases you just have to replace periodically. So have we done that, is one question. And if you don't have the answer, that's fine. You can get back to me on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's a specific person from IT here right now, but I know that in the operating budget, you'll see a proposal to help address some of those CAFR-related audit findings around our legacy systems and the retirement of such, and starting to phase in that. That's not necessarily a capital item, but an operating budget request that will be coming forward to you September 12th. But I'll get more specific
would I like
detail.
someone to come back and just say, look, we are going to handle those before we handle these other items?
Sure.
Okay. Number 2, transportation. I've got a few transportation ones. There was a piece in there about the 30th and Colorado underpass at $6 million, basically. And we got an email from a nonprofit organization questioning the value of that. And it is a lot of money that we put into these underpasses. So I'd really like to understand the community involvement on those and the prioritization. Again, it's very difficult in this format to see priority 1, 2, 3, 4, kind of sorted high to low for transportation. Where does that fit? But it is a high dollar item. So any feedback on that, Mike, in regards to?
So I can touch a bit on the background for that particular project. And from our assessment, it is a really key link in the system connecting the main campus to the east campus. What we're foreseeing in the not too distant future is the east campus transitions from a research-oriented environment to more of a core campus one. And I think some of those things are already happening in the classroom activity is occurring on the East Campus. And for instance, the aerospace engineering is actually relocating to the East Campus. What we see is over time, a really significant need for people to be able to traverse that quarter mile between the main campus edge and the East Campus. And so the 30th in Colorado was identified as part of those planning processes to be able to connect between the East Campus and then provide basically a protected crossing that will allow you to then access along College, which is 1 block south of Colorado. And then there's an existing underpass that goes underneath 28th Street, just there south of Colorado, and then that gets you up onto the main campus. So it's something that we've been focusing on for quite a while.
Mike, did you read that email that I'm talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's really a different philosophy, and I mean, I guess if you take the feedback that we got, then the philosophy over on Foothills is, yeah, that's a no-brainer because that's a highway.
Right.
But that this is more of a neighborhood, more of a community area, and so I guess I'm not an expert on which would be the best approach, but I would certainly like to, have them be heard out before we make a $7 million decision.
Right. And so maybe to continue to develop a little bit of how we proceeded forward with that project and respond to some of the questions that you've identified, we think that the project is a key project. And it's not to the exclusion of not doing a lot of the things that you received in your letter from Community Cycles. And so what we envision is, and we're doing the corridor planning for both 30th Street and Colorado right now with a community working group, is to both enhance the surface crossing opportunities, but also this underpass. And so we really see that both systems need to work. And I think we've got a number of different examples around the campus where we've dealt with very similar issues, such as the Broadway and College underpass, the Broadway and Euclid underpass, and most recently the baseline one. So I think we're in alignment with that we need to enhance both the surface crossings but I think that this is a rather key linkage. And then the other thing to really highlight is one of the things to recognize is that these federal projects take a long period of time. And so as they identified in their email, it's a $6.8 million project, of which 80% of the dollars are actually federal dollars. And so our investment is actually much smaller than that. It's about $1 million of local dollars, and it gives us some really fantastic improvements. But interestingly, as we submit for TIP projects, and Aaron and Matt and the various representatives that have been on the various Dr. Cog board and committees, that takes a long time. So we actually, before we submitted this particular project, we came to council and we said, what do you think about this particular underpass? And so in September 2014, we basically got council endorsement to submit this project. And so it would be extremely problematic for us to now, we've already secured the federal funding, that we could possibly go and try and give the money back.
That's another thing about this pivot file. Along with the source of funds, like Matt was talking about, dedicated source of funds, if the funding is already there, then that is a no-brainer.
Right.
So it definitely changes my view of this situation if you've already got it funded. Right. But I don't think that information is available to us in this document.
Yeah, it's certainly in the project sheets, but it would take you some level of investigation, I think.
Okay.
Do you mind if I follow up on
Go
that?
ahead.
All right. So thanks for bringing this up. I was going to bring this one up as well. I thought the letter did, raise excellent points. I do support the project. I mean, I think the underpass will be a real mobility enhancer. So this is really more of a comment since we're on this project. But just, I was glad to hear you talking about improving the safety of the surface travelers as well, because I think that's critical. I thought those points were really well taken. Right. So thank you for mentioning that, and I just encourage you to develop those as much as possible.
Absolutely.
As it moves on. And just from being the Dr. Cog rep, yeah, if we canceled that project, it would go back, the whole metro area would get it, and we would have years to develop an alternative. So.
Right.
Yeah, I have a follow-up. To what extent does the university participate in the funding in providing for that $1 million local?
Sure. Each project has been a little bit different over the years, and so they certainly contribute and help with both the funding and also with the design and the public engagement pieces. And then probably one of the more significant contributions is in land. And the need to, for instance, as you visualize Broadway and Euclid or Broadway and College, a lot of those things work really well because of the entrances to them. And so they've dedicated a lot of land to those types of improvements. And so that's another kind of in-kind thing that they have done as part of the projects.
Thanks, and that kind of brings up another sort of related question. Does the same thing happen with the underpasses that are provided as part of the Safe Routes to School?
So certainly Safe Routes to School is a key element of one of the things that we're tracking and trying to figure out where people are going and where to provide these types of facilities. And as we plan with the various schools, that's a key component. So for instance, on 19th Street in the 4 Mile, that underpass there on 19th out in front of Crestview is an element to the Safe Routes to School program.
And does the school district participate in the funding?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a few more for you, Mike.
I was going to follow up on comment on that, if it's okay. Just to follow up on the same subject. I just want to say I support the project as well, but I also support keeping the streets as safe. I find when I travel around the city that underpasses make it more advantageous to be on a bike, for instance, because you get to skip the stoplight. And so I think there's also, as far as bike commuters go, there's advantages to these underpasses, and you still want to keep the street safe for the pedestrians. So anyway, I just wanted to put in a plug for let's keep going with it.
Sounds great.
Ken?
Somewhere, I don't know the page, Mike, but it says TIP match / TMP implementation.
Right.
And that's 24.4 million?
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
So as we've discussed a bit, as we've been going forward and implementing the Transportation Master Plan, we've really tried to be opportunistic and leverage federal dollars. And so that changes over time as, for instance, the criteria that's used for selection of projects. And so as we are in the cycle where we're about to, in the next year, apply for the next set of federal dollars, we need the local match for that. And so that line item is really a place where we have allocated money that we can then, once we've start to figure out what projects to submit, then that'll become our local match.
So it's just a plug, basically?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It gives us the opportunity and flexibility that as we move forward, we can then identify the specific
And will
project.
council get to approve the prioritization of those before you move forward asking for federal funds?
Absolutely. So the process that we use is that we have the tab help us out, and then ultimately we come to council before we submit the projects and get your concurrence on which projects to submit.
Okay. And I didn't get to the detail of the unfunded projects, but was there anything about north-south bikeways?
So north-south bikeways is what we're identifying as a work plan item is to do this where we're really trying to look at the network comprehensively and Garrett, I'm losing the term that we're using, the low stress network analysis. And so as part of that, I think what we're going to identify, and we've heard a lot of feedback from folks of trying to provide a much better connection north-south, especially through the core of the city. And so I think that'll be, it'll come out of that process, and then we'll get identified in the CIP, and then we'll go to work on them.
Okay, and again, what process will it come out of?
So we've been calling it the low stress network analysis, and so we have an item on our work plan to start to do that analysis, and then have the community help us prioritize, and then we'll be coming back ultimately through TAB and City Council to figure out what those priorities are.
Okay, and speaking of planning, I think there's $350,000 in there for a TMP update.
Correct.
When was the last TMP done?
So the last TMP was 14. So we're anticipating that we're on a 5-year renewal cycle. So the money would be, we would be doing kind of the background work in 18 and then in 19. So that's where the dollars are identified.
And Mike, do you have responsibility for pavement?
Say again?
Roads?
Yes.
Okay, so my question is, I think we have $26 million in there, about $4 million per year for pavement.
Correct.
Is that enough?
So that's part of what Garrett's work group is working on, and so we have a system, which is a pavement management system, which is it's a methodologically based system to evaluate the condition of the streets and make recommendations on where to invest. And so that's, we have a target of where we would like the streets to be at, and we're shooting for that target, and we're about 4 or 5 years into our current program, and we're
But how
assessing.
are we, if we said, I mean, let's be honest, people do complain about potholes in our roads, and also.
I've never heard.
Never heard that. Nice one, Mike. So the question is, are we investing to the level we need to get the roads fixed, and as well the bike paths?
Right.
So I think to add to what Mike was just saying, it's only been in the last 3 or 4 years that the city has been really formally proactively investing in the pavement assets throughout the entire 300-mile street network. And so before it was largely reactive. It looks like we got a problem here, let's jump on it. There's a problem, let's jump on that one, right? Sort of the whack-a-mole approach wasn't being very effective to managing this massive billion-dollar asset that the city has, right? So we now have this formal pavement management program that where every year we survey the condition of the assets of the city, and we assign a condition number to each street. And that helps us to, as Mike was indicating, to determine where we are going to prioritize our investments each year. And so our overall, we call it an OCI, an overall condition index. Our goal is for the average of all the city streets to be 75 or better. We were able to keep it at 75 up until this last year. Our most recent survey indicates that we've fallen a point. So we're now just a point below the average where we want to be. So there could be any number of factors that are contributing to that. It could be that we had an unusual weather cycle. It could be that the weather of the winter prior could have affected that. So in terms of having a real strong, solid baseline to compare where we're at with where we want to be, that moving average is a little thin right now, but it would seem to indicate that we're in the ballpark, but we might in the future need to make some decisions about trying to continue to make that a top priority and understanding exactly how much of a priority that needs to be.
So this would be one of the metrics I think we would want to have in the metric pack. So if OCI is, our goal is 75, then where are we on the 75? And then my question would be, does the $4 million a year allow us to keep at the 75% level? Can we keep up with the needs?
Well, I'll say just right off the bat, if it was $4 million a year for the next 10 years, we're going to fall behind because construction cost indexes are going up anywhere from 8 to 12% a year, on average 10% a year, and so just due to the time value of money, we're going to fall behind. Ideally, at some point, there's going to be an increase in allocation for us to be able to maintain those assets.
When is that going to be? This is a 5-year plan, so why wouldn't we be considering that now?
So right now, we're programmed based off of what we think the system needs, and as you know, every single year we go through and we prioritize what the needs of the system are. So as we get more data coming in this year, it's very well possible that we'll take a look at the system and say, we need to increase that $4 million a year in order to make sure we're not falling behind.
And we did increase the funding quite significantly when the 0.15 was authorized, was that 2014? So I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of a doubling of those resources. And so I think what we're now in the assessment phase of, have we hit the mark or do we need to adjust our resources?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Sam, was your question related?
Yeah, it's a follow-up. So capital improvement plan must address certain kinds of needs, and then maintenance, routine maintenance, must address other kinds of needs in the road system. So what's the maintenance budget for pavement versus what's in the CIP?
Yeah, so the street maintenance ongoing operating budget is approximately $3 million a year. And so that would cover the routine, the other routine aspects such as pothole patching and some of the smaller patching and those types of activities. So it's not just the $4 million, but there's other resources that are dedicated to street maintenance.
And Mike, isn't there going to be another portion of tax that gets dedicated to transportation?
No, it was the 0.15 got added, so now the total dedicated sales tax and transportation, and the 0.15 has a sunset a number of years out, but is 0.75.
Okay,
total.
Thank you.
Jan, did you have any more?
One more transportation, and then I've got 2 more, and I'll be done.
Okay.
I don't believe this has been anything we've talked about before, but in the video it mentions bikeways on Broadway. And I thought that we had a strategy that was going to move the bikeways to 13th and 9th or something. So I was confused by that.
Yeah, I think the reference was to the bike lanes that are on North Broadway. And so you're absolutely right that the strategy for Broadway is that north of Iris, it's on-street
I'm
bike
with you.
facilities.
Okay, so
And
that's
then-
what it was
and then-
referring to in the video.
Right, and then
Okay.
south, it's 13th and 9th and 4th and...
Right, okay, great. I thought I was getting confused there. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Got a question real quickly on community vitality in regards to a future project. Is anyone here from there? There's been some discussion about parking on the hill and a specific proposal move forward, et cetera, and it is in the early stages, but I think it is something that should be considered by the council. Is that anywhere on anyone's roadmap?
That part of the Hill Hotel project?
No.
And I'm not aware of it.
Okay, so that's my answer. I'll follow up with Molly on that.
Okay.
Thank you. And I had a question about water, Jeff. I don't know if it's in there and I missed it, but is there anything in the plan about the CU South flood mitigation?
Jeff Arthur, Director of Public Works for Utilities. Yes, so we had funding slated for this year for the design. We've been working through the process, so that hasn't moved forward. So that money will roll over and continue next year for the design, and then we've moved, it would be a bond project, so we've moved that out another year to have time to get through the design and the...
Where do I find it in the document, do you know?
It's in the fund financial. South
Did you find
Boulder
it?
Creek. $30 million. Yeah, South Boulder Creek bond proceeds is on page 202.
Okay.
But we did push it out an additional year just because realistically, by the time we get through the design and permitting, it's not something we'd be ready to go to the bond market with.
Okay, I'll look into that a little bit more. Thank you very much. And then one final thing, and that is, I had an interesting conversation with Kurt today about middle-income housing, and he told me that he had some opportunities to acquire some middle-income housing, but he has no budget. And the budget that he has evidently is only able to be used for affordable housing. And so that got me thinking, since this is the number one priority for the community, is there something that we should be doing in SIP or something to jumpstart that middle-income housing strategy that we work so hard on? So has there been is housing anywhere in here that I've missed?
That again would be probably a general fund type of need or some other type of external or leveraged funding. So we don't have any ongoing funding sources that would be for housing.
So it's in the unfunded. I mean, there's kind of a placeholder for it in the unfunded. It says $5 to $7 million annually, ? Because to be fair, nobody's ever really figured out what it would take.
For example, could that be the...
There's a whole bunch of housing, really, there's a housing land bank, and they're all in the unfunded capital.
Is that something that the council could take a prerogative and say that it is a higher priority than, we think it's a higher priority and we can move it up?
Well, I mean, I can't, I'm not the one to answer that, but everything at this point has to come out of the general fund. And so that's really back to the question of how much capital is the general fund supporting in this 5-year period? That's question one. And then question two would be, if you wanted to make it more, well, then it has to come either out of those capital projects or out of the operating budget, because so much of our funding is, by my view, unfortunately earmarked, that, the general fund is constrained as far as capital goes, because most of it, almost all of it goes to operating, right? It pays for the basic city services, like police and fire and everything else, all comes out of the general fund. So hard to take money away from that. Could council have that conversation? It sounds like a budget conversation to me. Yeah, of course.
Okay, great. And then one last on page...
Jan, if I could just,
Yeah.
is that something you want, for example, to be, next time we talk about this, perhaps the city manager's office to get back to us with what, whether there's any possibilities there in the general fund for that type of program?
Yeah, I would like to, I mean, we spent a lot of time as a committee on it. We said it's our top priority, so I think to have it just down there and all the unfunded needs, it would be great to come back with some alternatives for how we could fund it.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, and I would just add to that to look at the commercial linkage fees as one of the options.
And then one last thing, I think it's either on page 22 or 36 of not the packet, but the other. It's, there's $480,000 in the budget for miscellaneous space needs. That's almost $500,000. So I was wondering, what's miscellaneous?
Who's the miscellaneous expert?
I believe that's a FAM project, but we're double checking. And thank you, Councilmember Applebaum. You can have this job as soon as you're done for explaining the restrictions between the general fund and kind of the pressures that we're seeing. Yeah.
Joe Castro, Facilities and Fleet Management. So that's a CIP that we put in every year for different projects that seem to always come up. About $80,000 a year is what we put in. For example, for next year, we're going to need to do a space needs analysis for city facilities projected to go into the Alpine Balsam area and also what will go into the East Bookend. So we just put a placeholder in there. Some years we spend it all, some years we don't. But it seems like there's always a need. So the 480 is the total of throughout the whole CIP. You're welcome.
If I can just, Jan, back to your comment about the critical needs and seeing all of the projects listed in different ways. And I realize this is a long document and hard to find all the different things. We did take all of the prioritization and guiding principles information that in the past had been provided in each of the department overviews and put it in one section so that we could look at all of the prioritization of each of the different funds, each of the different services in one section. It's kind of toward the end, starting on page, I think it's around 267, if we have the same version. And that really outlines how each of the departments approach their prioritization on these projects, balancing the critical needs and the critical maintenance, along with trying to make sure that we're opportunistic with other projects, leveraging other funds, and balancing the needs, as I think Jeff mentioned, sort of upgrading our facilities and making sure that we're current with the community's expectations with the balancing, the maintenance and the renovations and the replacements that we need. So that information by department is in here. The funding summaries provide the lists of departments in different ways, by department, by type of project, and then by fund, because we, unfortunately, it's not the one, as we've been saying, it's not the one big pool where we can just list the needs 1 to 100 of all of these different projects. They are prioritized within the restricted and dedicated funds that they have.
Maybe you and I can spend some more time. I'm looking at 257. I don't see what. I mean, I'd like to see something that's sorted top to bottom by biggest and most important, not by department.
Okay.
Because we have to look at the big picture. And I understand you guys do your planning by department, but we have to make the big decisions. So we really have to have a way to look at it, not by department. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, a prime example of that is the police infrastructure that to me seems so basic, and I believe the committee was somewhat shocked that it was, not being handled by the city. And now we're putting it on the culture tax. And, so I think those kinds of things where this body is supposed to be making decisions on behalf of the community for the most important ways that we spend money, and I'm just suggesting that there's maybe a couple different formats that you could provide us that would allow us to see the big picture a little bit better.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you mind if I chime in on that? I'd just like to support that request, and just a further thought on it, that that the individual sheets, they do take a long time to go through, and they're not the most user-friendly to council or to the public. And so there's the intros that you all write, which are helpful, and then the one spreadsheet of the dollar amounts. But something intermediate where it's not just one line per project and it's not a one kind of page bureaucratic sheet that would give some summary information, particularly for, I think, projects of community interest, larger dollar amounts. So I'd put in a plug for that. And the other one being that I think it's formatted for print, which is why all the tables are rotated. I think the percentage of people who will read it in print is quite small. So that's something to think about for future years, is really to format it for reading on a screen, because I think that's the way the vast majority of people will interact with it.
So I have one quick follow-up, Jan. I mean, I understand your question, and I think you're on track, but, and this, I think, always makes us a little crazy, but it's just the way it has to be, I guess. I mean, if you look at the capital budget, I just took a quick look because I was curious for 2018, so the first year this kicks in, and it's some big number, $121 million, of which almost $100 million is utilities. And so we always have this issue of including or not including them. I mean, you have to include them, they're part of the city, but from the standpoint of, and we should look at their projects, don't get me wrong, I mean, we need to make sure their projects are the right ones, but from the standpoint of funding that is kind of part of what most people consider the city, because utilities is their enterprise fund, you're only looking at $25 million, which isn't a lot of money for a city our size and with the budget that we have. And then, of course, we have the dedicated funds, and they make up most of that $25 million. I don't actually think the 0.25 for parks is dedicated anymore, but that's a different story. It all seems to go to parks, but I don't think it's actually legally dedicated, which is something council could take a look at.
Well, see, and that's my point, because I think if you took what you're talking about right now and put that in a format where we could see that, then we'd see, okay, here are the $100 million that's by utilities, and that's what I referred to earlier when I said one way. It's just stuff we have to do to keep the city running.
Yeah.
And then you take the dedicated, and so what we really have to make decisions on, critically, is only $10 million and what are our priorities, something like that, I think. So I'm completely on board with what you're saying. I'm just suggesting that maybe if it be put to us like that, it might help us be able to get to the important things rather than go through all of this room of data that it's difficult to make decisions on.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a way that we can display that in a more productive conversation manner. And to be clear, there is no general fund capital plan right now. So all of these are trade-offs between restricted funds that you would then be talking about once you take out kind of the run of the course type of operation. So just to keep that in mind, because we haven't formally completed a plan or developed anything, which you'll see initial start in September 12th. But right now, you might be surprised on kind of what is left over.
Right, okay, great, thanks.
Do we have any other questions, folks? All right, so does that take us then to the two questions posed on the screen here? The first is just the consistency with the goals and policies of the city, including the comp plan and sustainability framework. My sense is everybody agrees that the CIP is consistent with that. Matt's biting at the bit to.
Well, yes, except coming way back to the beginning, I think the CIP should show the things that we're going to do regardless, and I think it includes, frankly, the radio infrastructure. I suspect it includes some form of a North Boulder Library branch. I suspect it includes finishing the 4 Mile Canyon Creek, and I think those should be in the CIP, because I think that's an accurate portrayal of what we would do as a city over the next 5 years. We'd find a way to do those. And then the question is, what's next in the priority list? And that's what you might ask the voters for. Now, one big thing is, of course, the fire station. That, don't get me wrong about that. When you get the numbers that big, you probably have to go to the voters, because it's just really hard for the general fund to handle something that is that gigantic. But I I think if you really wanted to be consistent with the goals and policies, those things would be in the CIP.
So, Matt, I agree 100% with the concept. I guess the question is, what is the implications from your perspective with respect to the ballot? Would we have to rewrite the ballot initiative in some way from?
Well, I got lots of problems with the ballot, but I think to be, I'll use the word honest, I guess. I mean, I think the question is, what things wouldn't get done unless it was part of a ballot issue? Because I think those other things would get done. I think a council would be not consistent, frankly, with the goals and policies if we didn't find a way to fund those things. We just have to fund them. So what wouldn't get done? Okay, well, the fire station wouldn't get done because I don't think council could find a way to come up with that much money, frankly. So some would, some wouldn't, and I think we need to straighten that out and then figure out which things are the next in the hierarchy. But I mean, I think they have a handle on that. It's just a matter of, you know, understanding how those things were kind of ranked, in a sense, the things that are currently in there. And it may be some other things would be very hard to get done. Again, the things coming out of the general fund, because the general fund is kind of constrained. And it might be, well, if you really wanted to get it done, you'd have to cut some operating dollars. Okay, well, that's a good council conversation. I mean, that's worthy of a conversation that we haven't had.
Aaron?
Sam was next.
Or Sam and then Aaron.
So I understand kind of the desire for that ranking. I mean, it makes perfect sense, and it's a little hard to rank things across department within the general fund. I mean, that also is true. But about things like what we would or wouldn't get done, I think there's a little bit of speculation there, because we've had the North Boulder Library kind of on the talking docket in the city for 30 years, and it's never gotten done. So, you know, within the priorities that other councils have established and worked to, there are some things that have been historically been difficult. The fire department, of course, the moving of Fire Station 3 is one, because it's so expensive within the general fund. But you look down this list of unfunded liabilities, and even if you prioritized everything, there would still be a lot of things that, you know, could be left off. And I don't know if the CIP ranks things in exactly that way. In other words, if we threw everything in the CIP, is there some stuff that wouldn't necessarily be in there that could also want to be in the you know, taxes that we take out to the voters? An example of that would be the civic area plan. I mean, I don't know that that was, I can't recall, but I don't know that it was a CIP item that we were teed up and waiting to do. I think it was something that we said, let's take it to the voters and see if they would like to, you know, prioritize this. So I think there's give and take between the CIP and this kind of tax. And I think we should be a little careful about saying everything needs to be in the CIP, because then that locks in absolutely everything, and there's not a lot of room for flexibility or new ideas.
Aaron?
I think Sam's point is sort of well taken. I think, Matt, the points that you raise are really interesting, and I think I would like updated information on them. But I'm comfortable within the CIP with maybe handling this with a page in the intro, for example. Like here, proposed capital tax. You know, we are hoping to fund the following projects in the following amounts if we get the approval from the voters. They'll play into some projects that are in the CIP and other places. And then if that fails, then next year, we have a prioritization process where we say, okay, well, we were hoping to get these funded, but didn't happen. So let's reshuffle the CIP, bring some in, let some go. Because that's what we would have to do next year if that tax doesn't pass. So I think maybe, you know, a page that recognizes that would cover that, plus some follow-up information on how the city might handle it.
Well, again, I mean, we can have this, and we probably will have this discussion again, but, and I grant you, it's not always obvious, but it just does seem to me that some of these things we would figure out a way to do, because they really are top priority. And I just think the CIP should represent what the true top priorities of the city are. That just makes sense to me. And we don't have ballot issues every year. This is kind of a new thing that we're doing this every few years. So CIP really should represent the top priorities of the city, and usually has. It's a little odd to me, actually, that it doesn't represent the top priorities because it assumes that something will pass and it will take care of it. So, yeah, I think a few of these we'd find a way to do, and that's what I was trying to ask folks, and the answers seemed to be, yeah, we would almost certainly find a way to do them, because we'd be kind of crazy not to find a way to do them. So I do think that's important. I mean, we're passing a CIP. We don't know the outcome of a tax. We're charged with passing a CIP. I'd like it to represent the most important projects in the city.
To colloquy on that for a moment, if I could, I think, the CIP, as I understand it, it's a funding schedule. It's saying we're going to spend, we're planning on spending this much on these projects in this order in these years. And if we get that tax, then this continues to be an accurate statement of what we're planning on funding, in these years and in those amounts. So I think that it's an accurate document in that situation. So I think, which is why I'd advocate, rather than reshuffling the whole CIP, for adding additional information about how it interacts with the capital tax.
Jan, did you have something? Were you? No? I thought I saw you raise your hand. No? No, okay.
If I could jump in for just a few different comments, just to clarify. So first of all, this is a draft CIP, so we can always add things back in as we get more information. The second piece is really around the timing of when we do CIP and operating, and the challenge that it presents when we start to talk about general fund capital. So Councilmember Applebaum, two of those projects, the library and the radio infrastructure, are truly general fund capital projects, and yet we don't talk about that until September 12th. And we're really looking at the process of how we're presenting our budget and dividing up this lack of almost a month between when you see the CIP and when you see operating, and hopefully adjusting that moving forward next year. But I do think that if there is some general fund capital dollars that we decide to put in the plan come September 12th and during the public hearings, that would be incorporated in the final CIP document with those additions. So it really does represent the whole being, because you made a statement that we're planning like it does pass, and that's absolutely not the case. We anticipate that, or we like to plan that it doesn't, kind of worst case scenario, and have contingencies to add back in other nice to have projects. So just a few clarification pieces.
Okay. So I think subject to that discussion, nonetheless, everybody's comfortable that the CIP meets the comp plan and sustainability framework. The next issue is, do we have any additional feedback regarding the CIP than what's been discussed already? Do you need anything else from us then?
If you don't mind, I just wanted to clarify with Jean, knowing we're moving forward with second reading on the capital tax renewal in a week. Do you feel you have what you need to prepare that memo? It's to be released later this week, given this conversation we just had relative to the capital budget.
So I think the specific information that I heard for the projects that we would be discussing with the CCS renewal is really about what happens if this doesn't get funded. How might we go approach funding those projects, or what might happen? And I think we can provide some of that information with that memo.
Katie, I think that's part of the plan for September 12th.
Correct.
Okay. Anything else? I see Bob's guitar over there. Are you going to take us out with a song, or? I guess we're adjourned then. All right. Thank you much.
Thank you.
Yeah.